So it's
Thank you very
closing.
much, Ms. Pandek. All right, we have now reached 12:01. So in order to keep us on time, we're going to go ahead and begin the meeting. A good afternoon to you all. This is your COG Board Vice Chair, Christian Dorsey. I will be chairing the meeting today in the absence of Chairman White. So I'm now going to call this meeting to order. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us virtually for today's meeting. As you'll remember, the first rule of our virtual meetings is that you are to keep your microphones muted, please. If you would like to speak, please go ahead and unmute your line and then return back to mute as soon as you have concluded your remarks. If you are joining us with all of the features that are available on the WebEx platform, feel free to take advantage of the chat box. It is there where you can alert staff if you have any issues with your participation. And you can also pose questions that you would like to have addressed and communicate with your board colleagues. And as always, since this is a virtual platform, we do ask for your patience should any technical issues arise. First, I would like to lead us with the Pledge of Allegiance, and then I'll provide a reminder of the logistics that we'll use in conducting today's virtual meeting. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, we'll now go on with today's meeting. After some initial logistics remarks, I will turn it over to our General Counsel, Sharon Pendek, who will be conducting the roll call. She has been monitoring the participants box, and she will then orally complete a roll call to document your presence at today's meeting. Our webinar's audio and video are being live streamed via the COG website and through COG's YouTube account. To facilitate questions and comments for our speakers as smoothly as possible during our meeting, we have two options for you. The first, as I mentioned before, is to use the chat function to indicate that you have a question. After I facilitate questions that come in from the chat, I will then verbally call for any questions or comments from each of our major jurisdictions, the states and the District of Columbia. And this is, of course, a good option for those who are participating in today's meeting via the phone only. During votes, after a motion to adopt a resolution is made and properly seconded, we will proceed to discussion. After discussion, I will ask for abstentions and nay votes. And I will ask that you state your name and your jurisdiction as you state those nay or abstention votes. The rest, all the remaining votes, will be presumed to be yeses on a particular item. Now I'll turn it over to Ms. Pandek to conduct today's roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I can start with the District of Columbia, I have Ms. Perry. Is there anyone else from the district? For the state of Maryland, I have Mr. Collins, Mr. O'Connor, Ms. Schaefer, Mr. Wu and Mr. Harris, Mr. Moe, Mr. Davis, Ms. Newton, and Ms. Stewart. Is there anyone else from the state of Maryland?
Yes, Whitney Harrison.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Harrison. From the Commonwealth of Virginia, I have Mr. Wilson, Mr. Dorsey, Ms. Gross, Mr. Lusk, Ms. Briskman, Mr. Wolf, Ms. Wheeler, and Ms. Bailey. Is there anyone else from the Commonwealth?
David Meyer from the city of Fairfax.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer.
Daryl Moore from Essex Park.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moore. And Mr. Chairman, unless there's someone else, you do have a quorum.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pandek, and thank you all for participating today. We will now move on to item 3 in our agenda, where I will turn it over to our Executive Director, Mr. Chuck Bean, to provide his updates and his report. Mr. Bean.
Thank you. 4 items today. First up is Steve Bieber. on the energy system and grid resiliency in the region. So Steve.
Great, thanks, Chuck. Good afternoon, everybody. Just following the severe weather in Texas and the large-scale power outages I'm sure everyone saw there, Chuck asked me to say a few words about grid reliability in the Metro Washington region. I'm guessing the top-of-mind question is, could what happened in Texas happen here? The short answer I would say is, while it's not impossible, it's very unlikely. So what's different about the grid in our region, and why are the power outages like those in Texas unlikely here? As you may know, the metropolitan Washington region is part of the PJM interconnection, which is the largest grid in North America. In addition to meeting reliability standards set by the North American Reliability Corporation, or NERC, PJM and its members maintain a reliability assurance agreement. And this regional agreement requires members to secure resources to meet customer demand, including a reserve margin to prepare for unexpected demand or generator failure. So the kinds of events like you saw in Texas. In addition, following the 2014 polar vortex, if you all remember that cold event, PJM and its members began investing in numerous improvements. I'm just going to list a couple examples to give you a flavor for what they've been doing. One is implementing a performance-based incentive and penalty system to ensure that generators are available when needed to meet peak demand. The other, which I'm sure folks are familiar with, strategic undergrounding of vulnerable distribution lines, and otherwise just generally hardening their systems against severe weather. And then one other thing related specifically to winter weather is PJM has all of its generators complete a winter checklist and provide confirmation of completion before the winter season starts to make sure everyone's prepared. These and other improvements have dramatically improved grid performance since 2014 in the polar vortex. During the cold weather this year, for example, PJM and its members maintained reliable operation of the power system while exporting record amounts of electricity to neighboring systems. So I hope this is helpful. If there's time, happy to answer questions. Thanks.
Thank you. That's the 2-minute version, and we can come back with a longer version. And of course, your COG committees are looking at this and resiliency in all its aspects. Next up is Conti. We have a series of research items, impacts of the pandemic, and insights about what it might mean for the future. We have one teed up today, but I've asked Conti to give a little context to the upcoming series. Conti. Might be muted, Conti.
Thank you, Chuck. Good afternoon, all. I'll provide a brief update on 2 topics. First, on the impacts of the pandemic in our region. COG staff from across the different departments have been collaborating to compile data on a set of topics as a means of tracking the impacts of the pandemic. And importantly, to understand how the impact is changing people's response, whether it is to their travel behavior or to the economic activity. So the purpose of this is to help inform planning and programming decisions, to help us assist in the recovery, and also to adapt to the new normal. So this work began last year around July. We plan to continue this work certainly through this year and very likely next year as well, because we see the recovery over a period of time, extended period of time before a new normal is established. So we have been making presentations to the board and committees. Today, the 4 topics that we have been tracking is economy, transportation, health, and the environment. So today's briefing is going to be looking more at the economy, but we'll be happy to bring data and briefings on the other 3 topics as well. So the second topic I wanted to report on is the board's work on climate change. I'm happy to announce that the Global Covenant of Mayors, which you may recall is an international organization that is working with cities, counties, and countries around the globe on climate change planning. And this organization has found COG to be fully compliant with the global standards of best practices for climate planning. There are 5 regions in the United States that belong to this organization, and we are the only one to have complied with all of the elements of their best practices. The recently adopted 2030 greenhouse gas reduction goals, as well as the Climate Energy Action Plan, which speaks to the mitigation and resiliency actions, is what is being recognized by the Global Covenant of Mayors. I believe that this recognition will help provide the impetus and gain the support of the stakeholders to advance climate change work that each of you are undertaking in your jurisdiction. As soon as this finding is officially announced by the organization, we will post it on the COG website, and we will also mention it in a newsletter that you might find handy. So that's all I had to report. I'm happy to answer any questions should time permit. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Kanti. And for our 4th item, Monica Berretti on the Equity Officers Committee.
Thanks, Chuck. Well, the Chief Equity Officers Committee that was created at the end of last year has met twice so far, and we've had great participation from our jurisdiction. They elected leadership of Carla Bruce from Fairfax County, Tiffany Ward from Montgomery County, and Brian McClure from the District of Columbia. And they've identified priorities to focus on this year. One is establishing a regional definition of racial equity, communications and public messaging, developing a regional guide for local governments to establish a chief equity officer, and suggestions on developing a framework to implement and institutionalize this work. And the 4th priority will be to continue focusing on regional training. Planning to do a 2nd round of the regional cohort with the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, and looking into opportunities to develop a regional training for elected officials.
Thank you, Monica. And one addition that's been voiced by several of you from the board and also from the Chief Equity Officers is looking to form a program for racial equity education for elected officials. And the idea we're working on is, could there be a cohort of elected officials from across the District, Maryland, and Virginia in our region that might participate in a small group? So consulted some of you. Mayor Stewart has been, Tacoma Park was one of the first members of GARE from our region in the country, and she was also the chair of the National League of Cities REAL Council, Racial Equity and Learning. So I think offline, if others express interest or have ideas of what would be most useful for you or your colleagues, we would be interested. So Mr. Chairman, back to you. Happy to answer questions about any of these items or other COG things. Let me make one final note. If staff could drop in the chat box a link. We've been tracking some of the reopening activities. One document that we have is scanning what are school systems doing around the region. There's been a handful of jurisdictions that have initiated in-person hybrid learning as of last week. So that document in the chat there will give you a scan of what's happening in the region, at least as of the moment. Thank you. Back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bean, and we also appreciate the updates from Ms. Baruti Nunez, Mr. Srikanth, and Mr. Bieber. We'll now move to the 4th item in our agenda, which are any proposed amendments to the agenda. So in addition to our standard agenda items, we also have 3 substantive briefings that we will receive, one concerning the effort to achieve statehood in the District of Columbia, vaccine distribution throughout our region, and an assessment of the economic impacts due to the COVID pandemic. Are there any proposed amendments to today's agenda? Hearing none, we will move on to agenda item number 5, consideration of the minutes from the February 10th board meeting. After you've had a chance to consider, I will accept any motions to approve and to second the minutes of the February 21st agenda. Ms. Gross.
Penny Gross moves approval of the minutes.
Thank you, Ms. Gross. Is there a second?
Mr. Chairman, I'll second that. This is Derek Davis from Prince George's County.
Moved by Ms. Gross and seconded by Mr. Davis. Are there any abstentions? Are there any nay votes? We'll consider the minutes approved. Moving on to item 6, we have consideration of our consent agenda. We have 2 resolutions on our consent agenda today. You can find them on pages 13 and 14 of your board packet. The first, R18-2021, authorizes the executive director or designee to receive and expend grant funds from the FAA in the amount of $277,800 with a required 10% match to conduct phase 36 of the Continuous Airport System Planning Program. The second, R19-2021, codifies the fiduciary responsibilities and duties of the Pension Plan Advisory Committee and clarifies its role and process for managing the operation and administration of the pension fund that COG has for our employees. Can I have a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda items?
Gross moves approval.
Thank you, Ms. Gross. Is there a second?
Second, Supervisor Bailey.
All right, thank you, Supervisor Bailey. Can I have any abstentions? How about nay votes? The consent agenda, items R18 and R19-2021 are now approved. Next, we will move to item 7, statehood for the District of Columbia. And before I begin introducing our speaker and explaining the work that has been done thus far, I'll just note that at the beginning of COG's meetings, it is our custom to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. And if you think carefully about the words that we recite each and every month, those words are not inclusive of the District of Columbia, one of the founders of COG and very much the epicenter of our region. And so it is with that we take up this item today, where we will learn about the board's DC Statehood Task Force and the current effort of the district to attain statehood. It is a current effort, but it has been long in coming, and certainly something that is not new to the horizon. I've had the privilege of co-chairing the task force with Councilmember Derek Davis, and over the past month, we've had 2 outstanding meetings. And I'd like to thank all of the task force members for their work and their participation. Joining Mr. Davis from Maryland have been Reuben Collins, Denise Mitchell, and Vice Chair Kate Stewart. And joining me from Virginia have been Rodney Lusk, Phyllis Randall, and Justin Wilson. And we've also had participation from Council Chair Phil Mendelson of the District of Columbia. The task force has considered the history of the district and the path that has led them today, and the current that has led them to today, and the legislation that is currently being considered in Congress. We've also spent a considerable amount of time looking at the value statehood would bring, not only to the residents of the District of Columbia, but also to the metropolitan region as a whole. While the decision to grant statehood to the district is up to the Congress and is therefore going to be subject to partisan realities, it is important to remember that first and foremost, DC residents, a majority of them Black and other persons of color, are being denied the fundamental right of representation afforded to citizens residing in any other state, despite shouldering all of the responsibilities of citizenship. These individuals make up 11% of the COG region. Statehood for the District of Columbia would resolve the disenfranchisement of residents while also providing additional representation for our region and a greater allocation of federal funds and a greater control over our public safety agencies, specifically the DC National Guard. So today, our goal is to receive a briefing and learn, and while next month we will consider a resolution on this matter. Now, I am pleased to introduce our speaker, Monica Hopkins, who is the Executive Director for the DC chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union. Monica has been an invaluable resource for the task force, and she will share critical background on the path to statehood. So with that, we'll welcome Monica Hopkins.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me again. And I really want to start by saying that we are incredibly lucky to be part of this long, long road to statehood. In your packets, you received the congressional testimony that the ACLU of the District of Columbia submitted for the last oversight hearing. And some of what I'll sort of brief you on so you don't have to read the entire thing in detail is contained within there. But I think it's important to start at the very beginning of how did we get to this place where DC actually does not have the right to vote. And an important piece of the history here is that it has racist roots. Actually, Black men in the District of Columbia actually did receive the right to vote and had gained political power and then had the right to vote stripped away from them. And Southern senators had used this as a potential model for segregation across the country, to strip the vote from Black voters across the country. And it's from this bedrock sort of this history that we sort of need to acknowledge that we see this today. So voting rights today is this thing that we are talking about and enfranchising folks. And voting is the fundamental way in a representational democracy that we hold our government accountable. And we elect those who govern us. And we can remove them also through the electoral process when they fail us, which the residents, over 712,000 residents of the District of Columbia, cannot do. And so from that bedrock, we move forward, and there was a need to sort of allow at least the residents of the District of Columbia to vote for president. A lot of folks, and I may be repeating this for some of you, we did not have the right to vote for the president of our own country until 1961 with the implementation of the 23rd Amendment, which allowed the residents of the District of Columbia to have 3 electoral college votes and vote for the president. Moving forward to 1973, we then have the Revitalization Act, the Home Rule Act, that allowed us to actually have a fully functioning local government. So you are well aware we have a city council, we have a mayor, we enact our own laws, we pass our own budget, but unlike any other state, of course, those laws have to go through congressional review. And our budget is part of the appropriations process. And that's where this sort of congressional meddling and oversight and authority over the District of Columbia becomes impactful not only for the residents of Columbia, the District of Columbia, but also in the region. And so there are 3 ways that Congress can actually exercise this authority over the District of Columbia. So they can enact direct legislation, so they can directly legislate over the District of Columbia. They did this in the 1980s. Some of you may remember that the District of Columbia actually voted to remove the death penalty from our books. And then 10 years later in the 1990s, Congress actually made the District of Columbia hold a referendum to see if the voters of the District of Columbia wanted to put the death penalty back on the books. So imagine, for those of you from Virginia, your state legislature just took the death penalty off of the books. If Congress, a body where District of Columbia residents don't have voting representation, demanded that your state try to put that back on the books. Then Congress can also place riders on our budget. So we saw this both in the 1980s on the needle exchange program at the height of the AIDS epidemic. Congress said that the District of Columbia could not use any funds to implement a needle exchange program that had deep impact on the public health of District of Columbia residents and actually contributed to the skyrocketing HIV/AIDS epidemic. And George Washington University did a study recently that said the impacts of that, both economically and public health wise, we are still feeling today. Additionally, writers on our budget have impacted us in the way of marijuana legalization here in the district, where we cannot have a tax and regulate system. There's this loophole that was created because we could not put in a tax and regulate system for marijuana legalization, thereby having also not only a public safety impact, but also an economic impact. And then finally, there are disapproval resolutions. Disapproval resolutions are a little bit tougher because they have to go through both the House and the Senate and be approved by the president. But we see disapproval resolutions almost every year being added by congressional members. Most recently, we have seen some disapproval resolutions around the piece of legislation that was passed by our council to allow minors to receive the COVID vaccines without parental consent. And there are disapproval resolutions in Congress. And so, you know, imagine just for a moment, as I said, in Virginia, having this happen to the death penalty, or in Maryland, the law that was just passed for drug affordability being taken sort of out of your hands, and having, you know, senators from Utah or Texas or South Carolina deciding what may happen in your state. And why this is important to the region. What's interesting is when Conti sort of framed this impact of the pandemic around the economy, transportation, health, and the environment, it beautifully sort of outlined the impact that this has on our region and the District of Columbia's ability to advocate equally and in partnership with Virginia and Maryland. We look at this as, you know, a region of about 5 million people, 2.5 million in Northern Virginia, 1.9 in PG and Montgomery counties, and about 700,000 in DC. And we know that in order to grow the economy and expand opportunity, we need to focus not only on states and national policies, but our regional interests. And this allowing the District of Columbia statehood sort of completes our three-legged stool here in the region, gives us equal representation, allows us to advocate in making decisions for our region on issues such as transportation and infrastructure. We know Metro is going to be severely sort of impacted here. Advocating for our federal workforce in this region. Conservation efforts, such as Representative Holmes Norton had envisioned about 5 years ago, a regional federal state partnership like the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative for the Chesapeake Bay. Travel and tourism, education, and obviously ongoing pandemic funding and resources. And it's important to recognize that there are about 180 different avenues for federal funding and economic projects, of which the District of Columbia doesn't have equal voting representation in our premier sort of fundamental governmental body. That makes us at a disadvantage to be an equal partner in this relationship. Now, the path forward for statehood Currently, we have 212 members in the House on House Bill 51. We have 40 in the Senate on Senate Bill 51. The ACLU of the District of Columbia, in conjunction with our National Voting Rights Project, has analyzed both of those bills. And both of those bills are constitutional, that the District of Columbia could be admitted as a state through an admissions act. And for various reasons that are outlined there, it passes the District and Federal Enclaves Clause test, it passes the Admissions Clause test, and some of the arguments against DC statehood as it pertains particularly to the 23rd Amendment, we have identified not as constitutional questions, but rather as policy questions that could be dealt with through Congress, specifically in an expedited repeal of the 23rd Amendment, and taking those votes, allowing the new state to have those 3 electoral votes, and then allowing for the president and their family to vote in the jurisdiction in which they reside, making the federal enclave not a place which you could claim residence for voting. There is a matter of the filibuster, and so the filibuster is not the number of votes that are required to make statehood happen. The filibuster is actually the required number of votes that is required to end debate on an issue. And so that is an issue with its own sort of racist history and unpacking. And so maybe a topic for another time, but statehood in and of itself can be achieved with a vote of 51 for 51. And so I'll just stop there to open it up to any questions folks might have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hopkins, for that very excellent presentation, which covered history, context, tangible benefits for the district and our region, as well as a very concise but compelling overview of the constitutional questions and the legislative state of play. Thank you. Since the beginning roll call for our meeting, we have been joined by other members. So I'd just like to alert everyone that we've been joined by Tim Adams, George Barker, David Snyder, Phyllis Randall. We've also been joined by Denise Mitchell and Nancy Navarro, all of whom are participating in this discussion. And why don't we do some questions for Ms. Hopkins before we then hear some sentiments from the District of Columbia in multimedia form, as well as members of our task force. So first, we'll have any questions for Ms. Hopkins.
Mr.
Chair
Chairman,
Randall. I'll recognize Chair Randall, and then we'll go to you, Ms. Perry. Thank you.
thank you.
Well, first I want to make sure everyone looks at Miss Berry's shirt today. It is perfect and fantastic. So let's just do that for a second. Secondly, my one question is, you said it needed 51 votes. Can the vice president vote on this, or is this one of the issues that the vice president cannot vote on and it has to be 51 senators?
That is a good question rather than guess at that. I'm happy to get back to you on that question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Excellent. Ms. Perry?
Well, I want to commend Ms. Hopkins for doing a great job on statehood. We appreciate all the support from the ACLU. I read your paper because, as you know, the next hearing is March 22nd. You know, unfortunately, we had it passed in the House during the last session, but that session of Congress ended, so we have to start over. And the hearing is March 22nd. I would say I would expand just a little bit on what Ms. Hopkins said about how important it is to this region. It is important to all of Maryland and Virginia. I don't know if any of you saw the article in the New York Times, but the New York Times did an analysis of voter representation in the Congress and in the US Senate. And what the data shows is that a Black person only receives 75% of the representation as a white person in America. And this is attributed to because the Western states and very small states have such dominant representation. If you think about it, if you think about just Maryland, DC, and Virginia, and I'm talking about the whole states, we're talking about 15 million people. If you go to the West, to Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana, and one other state is 5 states, they have a tenth of the US Senate. And all combined, they have 5 million people. So just think about those numbers and how they get the representation for all the funding, for all the farming, for all the different things that they get because they dominate the US Senate with their representation. So it's very important to the region. One other thing I would like to share is that we have engaged the business community. And this is the first time the business community has been engaged on statehood. There is a statehood research group that was created under the auspices of the Federal City Council. And they have commissioned research very much in line with what Ms. Hopkins said, where they take it back to the founding fathers. And, you know, when the city, when they decided to move the capital to the banks of the Potomac, the people in Maryland and people in Virginia were represented in Congress like everyone else, but then they stripped those rights. At the time they stripped the rights, it was all white men. But over the years, when they passed the Emancipation Proclamation Act, when President Lincoln did that for the city, Black men had the opportunity to vote, but then they stripped that away because, and then one other time, they gave Black people the right to vote again, and then they got too active in the political process and it was stripped away. So it has been, it has become a civil rights issue. It is no longer just a matter of statehood, it's a civil rights issue. We saw it play out in the CARES Funding Act. I mean, every federal employee that works in town wants to be vaccinated, wants to be tested in Washington, and then we were cut short $755 million, which we just got. We just received in the new CARES Funding Act. But it's those kinds of prejudices that, and we were told that 4 Southern senators decided we shouldn't be treated as a state. And we're at the whims of people like the Maryland Eastern Shore Congress member that just one person can put a rider on a bill. And so we go through all of that. I'm working on this issue. I'm preparing for the hearing. So I just had to share a little of my passion with you all. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, it comes through, Ms. Perry. Your passion does indeed come through. So I'll throw out a question for Ms. Hopkins before we move to Ms. Navarro. So, and Monica, this may be impossible for you to answer. I'd just love to get your thoughts on this. I mean, much of the history and the fundamental contradiction with the ideas of taxation without representation, all of these values arguments, all of the benefits arguments, like these didn't just show up over the last couple of years. I mean, these have been the case for decades. You know, why do you think we're at this point that Ms. Perry mentioned, that we've got the business community that is joining in this fight? There seems to be a level of sort of momentum and critical mass. Members of Congress who have voted against statehood in the past are now sponsoring either HB 51 or SB 51. What's brought us to this point that seems like this is closer than ever?
Well, I can pontificate on this, but I think I might be close to an answer. I think it's Malcolm Gladwell who wrote The Tipping Point, and sort of, this movement that folks have created, right? These are conversations that have been going on for a really long time. And I think that in the sort of last year and a half to 2 years, I think that there has been sort of a national recognition of the intricacies of the District of Columbia, both with the lack of funding for COVID and the work that the mayor did to highlight this, and Eleanor Holmes Norton, Representative Eleanor Holmes Norton, did to highlight that. I do think that the racial reckoning over the last summer really sort of pinpointed an opportunity for us to talk about what many of us in this region have known for years and years and years, and connect with the hearts and minds of folks across the country who really cared about this issue. I think that voting rights and what we saw across the country leading up to the last election and the barriers to vote, and not only that, but now in state legislatures across the nation, we are seeing a rash of voter suppression laws being put into place. And so when you cannot talk about voter suppression and not talk about the District of Columbia. And then finally, I do think that it gets down to some of the other nuts and bolts about taxation without representation has always been something that resonated. But finally, the insurrection at the Capitol and the lifting up of these really sort of arcane ways of being, where not only do we not have control over our own National Guard, but also that the president could actually take control of our local law enforcement, I think captured some folks' attention that things like that need to be changed. And so I think it's this moment, but I want to say that the moment gives us the opportunity to shine the light on the work that has been done for years and years and years on this issue.
Thank you. Ms. Navarro.
Thank you so much, and really appreciate this presentation. I really wanted to lift up what Ms. Perry was describing, because as Ms. Hopkins was talking, for example, about some of the history with the needle exchange program, for example, at the height of the AIDS epidemic, et cetera, there is right now so much attention, and it's a positive thing, being paid to racial equity and social justice across the region and the nation. And I think a lot of times people may not understand, how did we get here? Especially now with COVID-19, how did we get here with these disparities affecting our Black residents, our Latino residents? And it is important to not only, I think, remind everybody in the framing and in the narrative, but also lift up, Washington, D.C. is a prime example. I mean, I am not confused that a lot of those specific things that occurred, and Ms. Berry was talking about, have been by design and have contributed greatly to a lot of these disparities as part of this conversation about structural racism, institutionalized racism. And I think that is a very important story, because as it was noted by Ms. Hopkins and Ms. Perry both, yes, last year we saw this renewed reckoning with systemic racism. People are beginning to connect dots, people who may not have understood what was happening necessarily and how. They have, I think, started to connect dots, and this is a very important narrative and story as this issue of statehood, gets to the front burner finally after so many years of many of us advocating. I think it is a very important a moment to elevate all of those decisions and the why. I think that gets even more people on board with supporting this very important effort. So I just wanted to elevate that, because it is, I think, part of what we all need to constantly remind folks as we're also presenting the reasons why we need to push for this to happen once and for all. Thank you.
If Mr. Chairman, if I may add one thing. Um, the research that the Statehood Research Group, under the auspices of the Federal City Council, the research that they commissioned, it shows that, and I think this is really profound because people haven't looked at it in this way. It was a wrong when the founding fathers created the city. It was a wrong that they intended to correct. If you go back and you read Federalist Paper 43, if you read all of the dialogues from the convention, you will find references to, you know, people saying, the founding fathers, Madison, saying, I am just uncomfortable with us creating a beacon of democracy. And then we're going to have a nation's capital with the inhabitants not able to participate in that democracy. And they said, no, we will correct it. And it was supposed to be corrected. But as Ms. Hopkins said, when at the point it came to get corrected, by that time, the city had become a large Black population. And it's in their paper, it's in the ACLU's paper. If you, and I urge you to read it just because, so you'll be passionate about it.
Ms. Perry, I'm just going to stop you right there because we as part of the force's work, that important bit of history has been unearthed by the COG staff, and it's going to be a central part of the proposal that we put forward to you next month. So I just don't want to step on our toes for consideration of that resolution, if that's okay with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So what we are going to do now, since I don't see any other questions or comments at this time, we are going to transition into some comments from members of the task force that will be facilitated by Co-Chair Davis. But Ms. Perry has also offered some videos for our edification that we are going to present at this time. So whoever is going to cue that up.
Hi, I'm Muriel Bowser, Mayor of Washington, D.C. I hope you enjoy your stay in my beautiful hometown, and I hope you get to see everything it has to offer. From our historic landmarks and amazing museums to our thriving neighborhoods and vibrant nightlife, Washington, D.C. has a little something for everyone. But our city does lack something important. Unlike all other federal tax-paying Americans, the 700,000 residents of Washington, D.C. have not a single vote in Congress. We live in the shadow of the Capitol, pay federal taxes, and serve in the military, but we have no voting representation on critical issues that affect the daily lives of all Americans and the future of our great nation. But we know how to fix this injustice so that Americans in Washington, D.C. get full voting representation and protect the ideals of our Constitution. We need to set a bold path forward to make Washington, D.C. the 51st state. Please join us as we work to build a more perfect union. Contact your elected officials and urge them to support D.C. statehood. Visit statehood.dc.gov or text DC to 20251 to learn more about how you can help.
Since World War I, over 200,000 Washington, D.C. residents, including my grandfather, my father, and myself, have fought in wars, but have no representation in Congress.
Washington, D.C. has over 705,000 residents and no vote in Congress. As a mother, that means that because of where I live, I don't have a say in important government decisions that affect the future of my kids.
Washington, D.C. pays higher taxes than 22 states, but has no vote in Congress. That's not equality.
Thank you. Just want you to see some of the things we're playing around the country.
Thank you for offering those, Ms. Perry. It crystallizes the issues, and I will say those are slickly produced. It's almost like you all are a state. Well done. All right, we'll now turn it over to co-chair of the task force, Derek Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Perry and Ms. Hopkins. And you find that ultimately that everything that needed to be said has been said. And what you find is the same jaw-dropping realities, I believe, that the task force experienced when Ms. Hopkins brought to bear the history in such vivid context, where, you know, the task force was trying to understand how we would present this topic. And, you know, with all business efficiency, we were looking to ensure that we had a short, impactful statement that could be used and pushed across the finish line so that we all could easily support. But as we unearthed the history and really dug in, we found that short was not going to get it. The reality is that there was a lot of context, constitutionality context. The other pieces that essentially go through the history of slavery that was articulated both by Ms. Hopkins and Ms. Perry that we feel is absolutely necessary to unearth. So I don't anticipate that our resolution that we hope to come to a conclusion on after a few meetings, we've had 2 already, that will come before us next month, will be a 1-pager. I do look for it to be at least a 2-pager at this point. And that's just the reality to ensure that contextually we as a region articulate to the rest of the country how we really feel. And what we really believe is a necessity as DC, as the District of Columbia, because in this context, I refuse to use the informal language, although I'm a child of the Washington metropolitan region and prone to informal language, like calling it the DMV. Or I've been born and raised in Prince George's County, so I've earned the right to call Prince George's County PG whenever I want to. And like I tell everyone, if you ever use it pejoratively, you'll find out I was raised in Capitol Heights. And I can also be very informal. And so I think that, you know, I don't want to monopolize the time as I'm prone to do. That's my mama's fault. I found out that too. But the reality is we're talking about misrepresentation. We are actually talking about the moment, because what January 6th showed us was the optics and the antics. Optics and antics. Where are we going? Forward with equity and equality, or back to Confederacy? Those folks showed up on our Capitol with flags and took them in that building, in the District of Columbia, in our federal space that we all hold dear and pledge allegiance to. What are we going to do collectively? And that's what this is all about. And so my committee, I thank the task force, Christian, my co-chair, he elucidated. I want to leave them time to articulate their feelings. So I'm going to stop before I really get mad. And let me say that my good friend who represents Southern Maryland, Mr. Reuben Collins, I hope he has an opportunity to speak in this space, because in our jurisdiction in Maryland, Montgomery County and Prince George's County has for the past years supported DC statehood through the District of Columbia statehood through resolution. The state of Maryland has a resolution on its desk right now proposed by a gentleman from Montgomery County, I think his name is Delegate Acevero, that needs support. It comes before our House Rules and Executive Nominations Committee on the 15th at 9:30. So all of my Marylanders need to pour in support to their the state legislature right now to support that effort. I am surprised and angered that we have not gotten that passed at this point in the state of Maryland. So with that, let me turn it over to Reuben.
Yes, I'm right here, and thank you, Chairman Dorsey and Co-Chair Davis. I appreciate this opportunity. DC statehood is very personal to me as someone that actually was born in the Parklands Turner community of the District of Columbia. And I was part of that great migration that moved many of us from the district to Prince George's County and throughout Maryland. So I was part of that. An emphasis on DC statehood is very consequential in many ways as it relates to infrastructure policy. We saw it more clearly as it related to the response to COVID. This is a nationally important and very historical perspective, and in terms of where we are as a nation. At the end of the day, it's purely about one man, one vote. I mean, that's all it is to it. I mean, you can't make it any clearer than that. And at the end of the day, the impact of this, puts us in a position, puts our region in a position, to really have an impact on the overall national economy. And I just wanted to very quickly share something that, that I was looking at. And this is coming from, the source is senate.gov. Put this in perspective. Since 2014, the Republican Party has controlled the Senate with senators that cumulatively represent less than half the population. Every time I think about that, I look at the potential impact of statehood for the District of Columbia. If the District of Columbia were an actual state that had representation that included 2 senators, the entire scope of our nation would drastically change. And that, more than anything else, puts in perspective the importance of what statehood is. And so I want to thank you, Chair and Co-Chair, for giving me an opportunity to be a part of this very important discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Ruben. I have 2 more that I want to call on, and I want to turn to Virginia, Chair Randall and Supervisor Lusk. And Supervisor Lusk, if you don't mind, I know that you're an absolute gentleman, and you would probably insist that Chair Randall went first. But let you go first, and looking at the clock, let Chair Randall close if possible, if that's okay with you, Chair Dorsey.
Mr. Chair, that works perfectly fine with me, so thank you very much. Let me start by saying that I'm delighted to serve as a member of the DC Statehood Task Force representing the Commonwealth of Virginia. I have immensely valued our task force meetings and the additional information that I've learned about the District of Columbia. While the idea of DC becoming a state represents a significant opportunity for the district, it is equally important to this entire region. As a member of COG, we understand how interconnected we are in this metropolitan region. This interconnectability becomes most discernible when we consider areas such as economic development, transportation, and public safety. The investments that DC has made in projects such as the Navy Yard, the Wharf, Union Market, not to mention the investments the city makes in maintaining our region's tourism infrastructure, have direct economic benefits to every partner jurisdiction in COG. The resolution that has been drafted by the task force and that will be reviewed by this board makes a compelling case for why the district should become the 51st state in this union. Amongst the more compelling points and arguments in the resolution, there's one that does stand out to me personally. And it's the point that in the district, residents in the District of Columbia pay more than $27.5 billion a year in federal taxes. And as we heard on the video, that exceeds the federal taxes paid by 21 or 22 states. Many of you may be familiar with my jurisdiction's One Fairfax policy. which commits to considering every decision that we implement through a lens of equity and fairness. I view the issue of DC statehood through that same lens. As a native Virginian, I am proud to support DC in its quest for statehood. I have updated Chairman McKay, the Board of Supervisors Chair in Fairfax County, on the progress of the task force work on DC statehood, and he has expressed support for this undertaking. So procedurally, we are planning to bring a resolution to our board once COG adopts its resolution on DC statehood. And I'm looking forward to being a patron of that. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Randall.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Vice Chairman of this task force. I am so pleased to be on this task force. I think it's such an important moment. You know, I was talking to some family members about this. And what I realized is that most people don't know that DC doesn't have a vote in Congress. They realize DC pays taxes and people in DC serve in the military, but this is not something on their radar. And in fact, it's not even something that I think most people in Maryland or Virginia think about. So this effort is so important because it would put this on the minds of people and why this is important, that they don't have a vote. I think that the resolution that's been put forward, Mr. Davis spoke to it just quickly. It's unlike other resolutions in COG. Sometimes COG resolutions are very high level. I'm so proud of the resolution we're working on because it's detailed and it has lots of facts in it. And so I ask that everybody take it, read it, look at it, commit some of those thoughts to memory, talk to your boards about it, talk to just people in general about it, because I think it's very important. Two things. One, January 6th was a game changer, I believe. I remember having people come to me and say, why doesn't the mayor just do X? And I had to say to them, that's federal property and the mayor doesn't have the authority to do that. People were aghast at that, of what the mayor didn't have authority to do right there in DC, although the people in DC were so impacted and affected by it. So I thought January 6th was a game changer. The other thing that was really and so important to me is if this is not an equity issue, I just don't know what is. I mean, this is taxation without representation at its most base and basic form. And so when we talk about equity at this time, while this is forefront in our minds, I can't think of anything more inequitable than not allowing people who serve in our military, who pay taxes, to vote. And oh, by the way, people who live in DC are also federal government workers. And so it's not just an issue for the region, it's an issue for the whole country. These people are serving. They're the ones who are getting out Medicaid payments and doing all the things that keep our country running. And so we talk about the importance for the region. It's important for the entire country. Just like my friend, Mr. Lusk, I have briefed our board about this at our last meeting. We have not yet decided to take up a resolution, but they have been briefed. I look forward to working with the task force. And all that I now ask is that Beverly sends me one of those T-shirts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you so much, members of the task force. We very much appreciate that. Wonderful sentiments all, and we'll have a chance. We talked about the resolution, which none of those of you who are not on the task force have seen yet, but you will see as part of your board materials for the next meeting in April. And to close this item, we are not going to have any additional comments since we will be considering this next month. Anyone who has something that they would like to say, please hold that in reserve until we consider it next month. And just remember, our region, of which the district is a central part, is the 6th largest of almost 400 metropolitan regions that we have in this country. And of almost 400, our region is first in median income earned. We are first in educational attainment. And this is despite not having full representation. Don't you think on a fundamental level, a region as dynamic and successful as ours ought to have full representation in determining the direction of our entire country? Of course it should, and the rest of the country should want that. So we'll leave it at that until next month, everyone. Thank you all, especially to you, Ms. Hopkins.
Mr. Chairman, can I just ask that you please make your resolutions part of the congressional record when you do it?
Absolutely. Thank you, Ms. Perry. We will. Thank you, Ms. Hopkins, for your work for the task force and for briefing us today. We very much appreciate it. We're now going to turn to item 8 on our agenda, where we are again joined by the district's Department of Health, Senior Deputy Director of Health Emergency Preparedness and Response, Mr. Patrick Ashley, who will again brief us on the status of COVID-19 vaccine distribution throughout our region. Welcome back, Mr. Ashley.
Thanks, Mr. Dorsey. I appreciate the opportunity. So I'll jump right in. I actually, as I was just preparing some of my notes, I thought the last time that I had briefed everybody that we were well into our vaccine campaign, but I think the last time I briefed this body, we were just talking about just before we got started. So exciting news. It's been an exciting couple of months here. So my comment said that, since the last time we talked, it was, we now have a third vaccine, but since the last time I spoke with you guys, we now have 3 vaccines. Which is very exciting for all of us to think that it was just a couple days ago here in the district and for Maryland and Virginia that we all had our first cases, and that less than a year in, we have hundreds of thousands of vaccines in arms, and we're well on our way to ending the pandemic. So I just think that's the best news of the year. So yeah, obviously we have 3 products. The newest one here, Johnson & Johnson, which we just started distributing, and your states just started distributing this week. We just did our first event here in the district on Saturday. Johnson & Johnson is the 3rd product that's been approved. It's a viral vector vaccine, which is similar to many of the other vaccines that are on the market. Not the mRNA vaccines that we saw with Pfizer and Moderna, which are newer vaccines, and a lot of people were more hesitant about those types of vaccines. This is a more traditional one-shot vaccine that doesn't require any of the significant handling characteristics that we saw with Pfizer and Moderna. So I want to talk real briefly about Johnson & Johnson. Just that there's been a lot of buzz about Johnson & Johnson, good and bad. Individuals who say that the effectiveness of Johnson & Johnson is a lesser vaccine than Pfizer or Moderna. What we've been saying in public health is that any vaccine is a good vaccine, and so we want residents to get the first vaccine that's available to them. That said, it's important to know that the studies between Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer and Moderna were done at 2 very different times. Pfizer and Moderna was done when there were no variants circulating in the world. And Johnson & Johnson, the study was done in South Africa, where there was significant amounts of variants circulating. And so it's really hard for us to say, the 66% rating of Johnson & Johnson is different than the 97% rating of Pfizer. The key takeaway here on Johnson & Johnson is that all 3 of the products have over a 90% rate of preventing severe illness and death, right? And that's what we're really worried about, right? It's not about how we getting a mild case of it. It's about how do we stop the spread of it. People that have less severe cases of coronavirus are less likely to spread the disease. And also, we're trying to prevent severe illness and death, and we define severe illness as being in the hospital. So what we've seen so far with Johnson & Johnson is that the public has actually been very willing to take it. We've seen that in other states. We've also seen that here in the district. We sold out of nearly 2,500 doses over the weekend at the convention center here in DC. We'll continue to do more events with Johnson & Johnson. The beauty of the Johnson & Johnson product, and I'll talk a little bit more about vaccine in general in just a minute, but the beauty of the Johnson & Johnson product is that it gives us a lot more ability to get it farther and deeper into the community. Pfizer and Moderna have some specific handling instructions. Fortunately, we did hear just recently that Pfizer no longer needs ultra cold storage if you're going to store it for less than 2 weeks. So again, as we get more data, they continue to change the way that we handle these vaccines. But Johnson & Johnson allows us to get it out to community members that may be homebound, or communities that we may not be able to reach a second time. And so it's a beautiful product to be able to use for some nursing home patients, some patients that may be homebound, that may be homeless, or that we may otherwise have challenges following up with. And so we're very excited here in the district to see how that we utilize Johnson & Johnson as just one of the 3 vaccines that we utilize. The other good news here about vaccine is that we're not done. There are other vaccine products that are still in clinical trials. And so we expect that in the coming months that there will be additional products that will become available. And that's great. That gives us more opportunity to get more vaccine out. Jenny Sheeter asked me to look into my crystal ball before I got on this call and say, what does vaccine distribution look like in the next couple of months? You all have heard President Biden's comments with regards to trying to get out enough vaccine for the entire population by the end of May. And what it looks like now, to the best of our knowledge, is that sometime in May, maybe early June, that supply will outpace demand. And what that means is that there'll be more vaccine on every street corner than people that are asking for it. And so that's great news for us. We'll be able to move away from some of these mega locations and start thinking about coronavirus vaccination in the same ways that we think about flu shot vaccination. Every pharmacy will have it, every doctor's office will have it. And it'll just be available. And so that end is in sight. And I think that's great news. Some of the other things that we're very excited about, with regards to distribution is you saw that President Biden also announced the partnership between Johnson & Johnson and Merck, which is great news that 2 competitors have come together to basically double the capacity to produce vaccine. So what it looks like, to the best of our ability, is sometime in the next 4 weeks or so, we'll have a good idea about the allocations of Pfizer and Moderna. We think that they'll continue to raise in terms of quantity available to all of the states for the next couple of weeks, and those will level out. And then we'll start getting a very consistent, predictable supply as those production lines have really reached their maturity and are able to produce at their full throughput. That said, we'll also expect to see that Johnson & Johnson is ramping up their production, and so we'll expect to see a significant amount of vaccine. Those allocations are a little bit still up in the air about how much vaccine we might see from those. But with that Merck partnership, we can expect to see a good number of doses from Merck and Johnson & Johnson. And with those products being single-dose vaccines, that doesn't mean, with Pfizer and Moderna, where you had to have two sets of the same vaccine to be a full dose. So exciting news there. The other topic I wanted to talk about is technology and registration systems. It sounds very easy, and I'm sure many of you all have experienced this in the last few months, where it sounds very easy to get individuals registered and qualified for a vaccine or screened into a vaccine. But the reality here is that these technology systems that are used to be able to book appointments and to be able to collect demographic information and insurance information are very complicated systems that have not really reached a state of maturity in the marketplace. They've been put together very rapidly over the last 6 months. And so you've seen, especially, you've seen this in DC as well, where we've had some frustrations with the different registration systems. That being said, we see that every hospital has a different registration system. We see that the federal pharmacy partnership, which now provides direct allocations to pharmacies such as CVS and Walgreens, all of those different locations all have different registration and screening mechanisms. And so one of the takeaways as we're looking at this as a region is understanding what the public actually sees, and having significant amounts of access points is great. We ultimately, as I mentioned previously, really want to have every pharmacy on every street corner to have vaccine. But if every pharmacy and every street corner has a different system or a different way to access it, that becomes very confusing to our public. And as we look at things like equity and individuals that may be a little bit suspicious about the different vaccines that are on the market or the way that we are distributing the vaccines, that makes it very challenging for them to find the right door to be able to get vaccine. And so I think one of the efforts that we as public health and community and government leaders need to do is really making sure that we're streamlining the ability for individuals to get access to the vaccine. That's a little challenging because we don't have enough vaccine yet for everybody who wants it. But we've really got to make sure that we're focusing all of our efforts through an equity lens. There's been a lot of conversations over the last few weeks or months about different populations that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID and also who are not having high uptakes of COVID vaccine. And so working with your communities to understand how are we getting deep into those communities? Are we going door to door, knocking on doors, making appointments for them? Are we making direct dial phone calls to get them in? And the beauty of, again, having products like Johnson & Johnson means that we can get out into those communities and we can actually deliver vaccines directly into the communities, knock on the door, put a shot in the arm, same time or very soon after. And that's something I think that we're going to need to start looking at very seriously in the coming weeks. And talking about just communication, just making sure that it's been very important for us to look at how we're utilizing trusted sources for getting out vaccine outreach. So making sure that we're relying on the different community groups. And really, we've seen a great deal of success with peer-to-peer impact. So you actually, whether it's you personally or encouraging other individuals to have conversations with your family members and your professional networks and your personal networks to say, hey, I got the vaccine. And there's been a lot of, information that's out there that people have said, I've had a lot of symptoms from this. But actually just having those conversations with your peers and colleagues and friends to say, it's still good for us to get vaccinated, even though there may have been some symptoms. I might have had them for 36 hours. It really wasn't that bad, and here's why you should trust that we need to get vaccine out into the community. There's also been a good deal of conversation just about reporting. And as I mentioned earlier, these technology systems that we use are complicated, and many of the providers that are reporting into these different technology systems are starting to report into these technology systems just in the past couple of months. And so again, there's a lot of complications with understanding where we are vaccinating, where we're having impact. And so you'll see different conversations about different data, and the New York Times reports something different than Bloomberg, which reports something different than the CDC. That's just because of all the many different data systems that are used to be able to track the vaccine. One of my last points here before we open for questions, is about the CDC guidance that came out yesterday. I'm sure many of you have seen it. I'm sure your residents have seen it as well, and it's exciting where the CDC has finally put out guidance to say, what can I do as a fully vaccinated person? We've heard anecdotally from a lot of our constituents, especially the seniors, that this is their winning lottery ticket. They get vaccinated. I can see my grandchildren again. I can get out on the town. And the reality here is that's great news, right? The society is getting back to normal. But prior to yesterday, we really didn't have a lot of guidance from the CDC on that. And what the CDC said is that fully vaccinated people, and what fully vaccinated people means is that you are 2 weeks post your final dose. And so if you're taking Moderna or Pfizer, that's either your 21 or 28 days plus 2 weeks. Or if you're taking the Johnson & Johnson product, that's 2 weeks after your initial shot so that your body can make sure it builds up its immunity. But that fully vaccinated people can gather with other fully vaccinated individuals without wearing masks or physical distancing. And here's the key part, and that's in small groups. This guidance has already started to be misinterpreted as we can start having large events at Jiffy Lube Live or the convention center. The reality here is that we're not there yet. We're still, having small, intimate gatherings with other fully vaccinated pods, as some people like to call them. And there's also the ability to have some limited gatherings with unvaccinated individuals who may be at lower risk. We want to make sure that we're being very careful around those individuals that are higher risk. And also those fully vaccinated individuals can refrain from quarantining if they're exposed to someone who may be symptomatic from COVID. And so again, great news. It's progress. It means that we can take some degree of comfort as we do with other vaccines out on the market, such as flu, that we can start actually getting together and not having to really have quite so much social distancing and isolation. That said, again, the key point here is small groups. It's supposed to be households that are getting together. And what the CDC also continues to recommend is that even fully vaccinated individuals, they continue to wear their mask in public. We continue to do social distancing when they're not in that vaccinated small group or with individuals in a small group that are unvaccinated and low risk. That we should still avoid large gatherings, that we should still get tested, and that we should still follow travel recommendations. So we're not out of the woods yet. There's been a lot of conversations about when do we get to herd immunity, and we don't have to worry about that anymore. We've got quite some time before we get to herd immunity. There's also been a lot of conversation about herd immunity in that we don't have a vaccine yet for individuals who are under 16 years of age. And so we still have a significant amount of the population who is unable to get vaccinated at this time. So we've got some ways to go, but since the last time I briefed you, I guess about 4 months ago or so, some great news here. Vaccination rates are good. We're getting shots into arms. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Chairman. Happy to take a few questions if you'd like.
Thank you, Mr. Ashley, and I know your time is limited, so we'll go straight to questions from anyone. And as a reminder, you can populate them in the chat. You can use the raise hand function, or if you're on video, you can just signify your desire to ask a question. Mr. Davis.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that, Mr. Ashley. People are getting excited about the things to come, and I'm hoping that in their excitement, we all remain vigilant with regard to the things we know we need to do. So just a quick question, and this may not have been discussed yet amongst the people who actually know, but if you got Moderna and you got Pfizer, you have a 2-shot vaccine. It seems to me that we're moving to a place where this vaccine is probably something that's going to be in our future, or I hate to use, my only informal way of describing it, the new flu shot. So it seems like, that's possible. Is there any thought with regard to how that might become the new flu shot? And if in fact you had a 2-shot vaccine, do you think it'll be a 2-shot follow-up, in perpetuity?
Yeah, great question, Mr. Davis. And to be very candid with you, I don't know the answer to that. I think there's still a good bit of research being done. There's the look at the thought of maybe a third booster shot that you'll get every year depending on the product. There's even, I was doing some research this morning, and there's even an oral vaccination that there are two products that they're looking at taking a pill. So I think the body of knowledge is still developing on this, and I think the sooner that we as an entire world can get a hold of the pandemic, the less likely that we'll need this, and hopefully this is a once in a lifetime thing, and it'll go away and it won't be seasonal like flu. But I still think we have some more to learn on it.
Appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Mr. Ashley, so do you have any updates on where testing stands for looking at age groups under 16? As we accept the light at the end of the tunnel for adults, many people's focus is turned to their children. So do you have any sense of where they are in the trials for those, or the studies for those?
Yeah, so there are studies going on right now. So typically, I think the last time we talked about, there's different phases of study. There's phase 1 through 3, which most of you are familiar with. There's also phase 4 studies as well that look at the long-term effects. But there's also concurrent studies that go on. So as soon as the recommendations are made for one group, not even as soon as, many times concurrently. So we do know that there are studies going on that are already looking at children and how they can say if they can safely take the vaccine. What we expect to see is that it'll start with probably 13 to 16 years of age. And then it will move slowly down from 13 to 16 down to maybe 8 to 12, and then from below 8. It will likely not be all at once to say, all right, anyone can take the vaccine. I'm not aware of the timeline on that. I'm not sure if one has been published.
Thank you. We'll now move to a question from Mayor Stewart.
Great, thank you very much. I want to preface my question, Mr. Ashley, since you said peer-to-peer impact is so important, to let folks know that I was actually able to get the Johnson & Johnson vaccine on Monday morning at a mass vac site in Waldorf, Maryland. I did have some small side effects on Monday night, didn't sleep much, so I'm a bit behind on my emails. Sorry about that if folks are waiting for something from me, but feel fine now, and just want to really encourage folks and reiterate what was said about get the vaccine. If you're able to, please get the vaccine, any of the 3 that are available right now. And I guess I just want to, my colleague in Rockville posted something in the chat, and one of the things that we've been trying to work on in Montgomery County is to get a mass vac in Montgomery County and to increase vaccinations. I sit in a very privileged place that I was able to take off from work on Monday morning, drive the hour to Waldorf, drive the hour home, and get my vaccination, but we really need to be expanding the sites. So I know you're not from Maryland or Montgomery County, but any thoughts on how we can be doing a better job of expanding the sites? Thank you.
Well, thanks, Mayor Stewart. I appreciate you sharing about your vaccine experience, and I certainly agree. From a personal note, my mother, who lives in Southern Maryland, Southern Virginia, had to drive 70 miles to get a vaccine. So I certainly understand. Individuals may not have the resources or time to do it, and I think there's a balance here of how do you create these large mass vaccination sites, but also how do you create much smaller community sites, especially in the urban areas where people may not have as much access to cars, such as DC and in Montgomery County as well, and some of the surrounding areas. So certainly support that. I don't have any specific thoughts about Maryland, but I definitely support the more vaccine sites, the better.
Thank you. I see Ms. Navarro would like to comment.
Yes, thank you. Following up on the comment on the chat, our county council receives updates every Tuesday during our legislative session. Yesterday, we did receive an update that our health officer and the director of our emergency management office will be taking members of our state leadership to tour a possible site in Germantown. We have been requesting this for quite a while and have been puzzled at the fact that Montgomery County, being the largest jurisdiction in the state, has not yet been designated a mass vaccination site. But we do have, a number of sites that we have identified, and at least there's a little bit of progress in the sense that there will be a tour, and we hope that that will become a reality. I think it is important to note that, of course, the issue right now is supply, and it was stated very soon that will change. And so it's very important, I think, for jurisdictions to be ready in order to accommodate that surge, and then hopefully figure out how it becomes standard through our private physicians and things like that. But yeah, I mean, it's been quite a challenge, and we have communicated that in writing. We have had phone calls that we've made. We've been working with our delegation, who obviously are the ones who are front and center, because this is the state controlled distribution and it's not up to the county council, but there seems to be a little bit of progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Navarro. And I don't see anyone else wishing to be recognized, and it looks like this is coming right at the time that Mr. Ashley has to depart for another obligation. So we very much thank you for your time and joining us again with light at the end of the tunnel. We thank you so very much for all of your work.
Thanks.
We'll now move to our final item on today's agenda, where we will hear from COG's Director of Community Planning and Services, Paul Desjardins, on the regional economic impacts resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic and key considerations for all of us as policymakers as the region plans its recovery. Mr. Desjardins, are you ready to go?
I am, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. Can everyone hear me okay?
We can.
Terrific. Well, I thank you again. I think the context of the previous item dovetails very well with this item. If we could move to the next slide, please. As Conti mentioned at the beginning, I thought he gave a very good context for this presentation. It's no surprise to everyone on this call that COVID has been pervasive throughout our personal and professional lives. And so what we have chosen to do here at the Council of Governments is to really take an interdisciplinary approach and look at the impacts that we can track through data points that we have at our fingertips, that we can obtain from other sources readily available in those different domains that you see there at the bottom. I will focus, as you said, Mr. Chairman, on the economy, but my colleagues would be very pleased to come back at a future date to talk about any of the other topics that you see there. Next slide, please. Quickly about what we are looking at. This is really, and again, I should mention this entire presentation is in your packet, so I'll just go through some of the highlights in each slide, but be happy to answer questions at the end. Very quickly, though, again, the approach, as I said, is this multi-sectoral approach. To give sort of a general overview, general context, a lot of the data points I will share with you today, many of you have heard in some forum, and they are continually changing. And again, that is part of our effort, is to monitor trends and be able to stay on top of them. With that in mind, some of them data points are reported more frequently. Some there's a fairly substantial lag in time, but again, we're just reporting very objectively and not intending to make any sort of predictions based on any of these data points we're tracking. Next slide, please. Again, very much aware of the timeliness of the data. This is something that you all would see on a daily basis, likely. This is as of March 1st last year, COVID cases and deaths within the Washington area. Again, a data point that is updated on a regular basis and shared by our health departments. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the economy, we of course want to look at the number of jobs. This is a two-year slide showing two-year trend in total employment in the region. Call your attention to that dramatic plunge between March and April of last year. We lost 300,000 jobs in 1 month, and then you can see a slight additional drop going into May of about another 5,000 jobs. This is more jobs lost in this region in 1 month than we lost during the Great Recession more than a decade ago. And the good news, as you can see, is we've recovered. We've added about 180,000 of those lost jobs since last year, which is about 3/5 of all the jobs lost. But again, I'll delve a little bit more deeply, rather, into some of the sectors and how there are continuing challenges. Next slide, please. It's always important to look at this in context. What we're looking at here is in green, the number of jobs that our region lost as compared to the other 9 largest metropolitan areas throughout the country. Whoops, I think we lost the, there we go. Thank you, Monica. Very, very stark, very interesting. Among the 10 largest metropolitan areas, we actually lost the fewest. And it's interesting, you look to the far right, Los Angeles, more than 800, almost 900,000 jobs. New York metropolitan area, almost 1.8 million jobs lost in that large metropolitan area. Next slide, please. Commensurate with that, you see a tremendous spike in our unemployment rate in April of last year. Traditionally, we have a very healthy economy. We have an unemployment rate about a point or so below the national rate. We have a job growth rate that's traditionally about a point or two above it. What we saw is in that 1 month time period, our unemployment rate essentially tripled, almost to 10%. But even at the peak, we were still fully 5 points below the national unemployment rate. But I call your attention as the two lines head to the right throughout time. And during the month of October, for the first time, the national and local unemployment rates converged for the first time in many, many, many years. But again, as you look further into the future, further along rather than the time series, by December, our local unemployment rate was once again below the national rate at about 5.6%, but still fully 2 points above where we had been going into the pandemic. Next slide, please. Reflecting the unemployment. This is a data series that we have begun tracking that is produced on a weekly basis. Unemployment insurance claims available by the states and by individual jurisdictions. You see that tremendous spike during the second week in April. Generally, unemployment insurance filings dropped off. There was a bit of a spike at the beginning of May, but generally filings were declining throughout last year, with a slight uptick at the end if you look during January of this year. There's a slight upturn in unemployment insurance filings, but again, nothing that we see to be alarmed by at this point. Next slide, please. I mentioned that some of the data are lagged. What we're looking at here is the most current data for comparison by individual employment sector. And when I say most current, that would be for December of 2020 compared to December of 2019. So it's an over the year change in jobs by sector. And so clearly what you see in the center of the slide, the dark blue bar for leisure and hospitality, and then that lighter bar above it for accommodation and food services. It's a subset of that larger sector. Clearly the sector that has been the most impacted by employers in our region. And then as you see below, a number of other sectors within educational and health services, transportation and utilities. It's interesting to note the very first bar on that chart at the top, you see a small increase in federal employment. What was that? You might ask. It was the 2020 census, the temporary hiring of federal census workers, rather, to support the annual decennial census. Next slide, please. I mentioned that we'd look a little bit as to the nature of different workers and how they've been impacted. What you're looking at here, and it's probably easier to look at in the handout than on the screen here. This is a dot density map showing the location of workers employed in leisure and hospitality. And again, you can see in the narrative specific neighborhoods that we described, but the bottom line is these folks live everywhere throughout the region. They could be your neighbors. They are definitely people that you encounter on a day-to-day basis. So to give you a sense of place of residence, where are some of these workers who are being impacted in that earlier slide that I showed you? And again, I don't want to exaggerate. Not every single dot here represents an unemployed worker, but this is just to give you a sense of the universe of where those folks would be residing. Next slide, please. This pivots directly from important work from this body 2 years ago. This is a summary of the most current permitting activity in the region. That red dotted line near the top at 32,000 units, that's the COG board target. That blue moving line on the bottom, again, going back all the way to January 2 years ago through the most current period, is the number of new permits being issued. We're at about 21,300 units for the most recent period, well below the number of units that are in the board target. And we've been engaged in a number of conversations as recently as yesterday with some of our strategic partners on how to address this challenge. It's interesting to note as a sidebar, I came across an article a few weeks ago that suggested the month of December was the fewest number of housing units available for sale in the metropolitan area ever in history that the realtors had actually recorded. Next slide, please. I showed the earlier comparison of employment relative, or job loss rather, relative to the top 10 metropolitan areas in the country. Again, this is that same universe. You see us there in the middle with the 21,000 units permitted in our region. You look to the far right, and again, we are sort of in the middle of the pack in this particular slide, but you look to the far right, Dallas and Houston more than double, almost triple the number of permits that we are issuing. But it's also a very different situation there, where they have tremendously large land areas, growing, I would almost suggest sprawling beyond, whereas we are a more mature region. And as the planning directors and housing directors discussed, new additional housing is a challenge of infill and redevelopment, which is a much more complicated task, as everyone knows. Next slide, please. We do monitor on a regular basis commercial construction trends, and one of those data sources that we tap into is CoStar, which provides vacancy rates. And so what we're looking at here is the change over the year from the fourth quarter of 2019 to the fourth quarter of 2020, the darker blue bars of office vacancy rates in the region. What you'll see is they are increasing slightly, largely a point or so in the jurisdictions where they're increasing. But again, it's contextual. If you went from a 5% to an 8% increase, you could argue that's a 60% increase in your vacancy rate. We're very mindful of this is in fact something that is clearly in flux and needs to be monitored. And in fact, I saw an article yesterday about a very large office tenant. It was the first article I had seen to that effect, suggesting that they are in fact revisiting something like a 2 million square foot lease that they have in the city of Alexandria, and whether or not they wanted to in fact reflect current telework trends and rethinking that space. So again, long-term investments, long-term decisions by employers, but something that clearly needs to be monitored. Next slide, please. This is the companion, obviously, change in retail vacancy rates, not quite as pronounced perhaps as office vacancy, but again, something that we would want to monitor going forward. Clearly, small businesses that have been impacted by this, and also ongoing structural changes in national retailing. I read another article again just a day or two ago that Best Buy is actually, they've not announced, but Best Buy is thinking of closing shop in a number of locations across the country. Next slide, please. So these next two slides come from some national survey data that was shared last month, actually at the Northern Virginia Chamber of Commerce. So this first is looking at the potential long-term effects of COVID from a personal perspective, from the consumer's perspective. And so what you see there, the question posed was, when the government finally provides information that the spread of the virus is flattening, how long would it take you to do each of the following? And so you see the list there of about a dozen or so activities, and the columns correspond to a corresponding period of time. So call your attention again to really the second column. So even 6 months after this, again, was before the conversation we just had about vaccine production, but really posing rhetorically. 6 months after vaccines are fully distributed, 3/4 of people who responded said they would still be anxious to either go out to dinner or go into the office. If you go to the far right, you can see the answer, or the responses rather, for long term. Would this change your behavior? Would you never again do it? One thing I would call to your attention there is sort of at the lower right-hand corner. 1 out of every 6 people said going forward, they would probably never greet a person with a handshake. And about 1 out of every 9 people said they would never use public transportation. There's been a lot of surveys in this region. We are very different in that regard, and we're very, very optimistic and very supportive of Metro Rail. But this is clearly an interesting series of consumer preferences at the national scale. Next slide, please. This then is the companion. This is a survey done by RC Elko on commercial real estate markets. And I call your attention particularly to the orange bars. This is where their major clients, commercial real estate developers, investors, and so forth. The orange bars are the enduring. You see this as, in fact, an ongoing trend when it comes to commercial real estate. So the top very low concerns about decreased interest in proximity to transit. So this, again, is sort of a corollary or a contrast to the previous slide. Those sort of middle 3 bars that assert that fully half of their clients, fully half of the respondents say there will in fact be impacts to commercial and residential decisions with both homeowners and offices choosing to relocate more towards the suburbs. But then the last bar, the very bottom one, which again, goals and strategies that we've advocated for a long time, more than 75%, close to 85% of the respondents from an employer standpoint said they do believe that telework will be an ongoing trend. And again, not surprising, but very interesting to see it codified at the national scale. Next slide, please. So wrapping up here, the planning directors are very much aware of each one of these impacts and how it affects their work plans, how it affects their efforts to help you make wise land use decisions. So at their meeting in February, the committee members took it upon themselves to self-select, volunteer to lead a conversation on any one of these particular topics that you see here. And from the perspective of how do they see this issue being addressed going forward, bringing in an outside expert, but the jurisdictions will be leading these conversations. So we'll start with public participation and public space use led by our two co-chairs from Montgomery and Alexandria. We'll have a conversation on transportation in April led by our TPB staff. And then again, you see the list of other particular topics. The idea, again, is to really put our finger to the wind right now and get the best sense of where are things going, bring in thought leaders, experts to help us really get a handle on where would the trends likely go into the future. And we'd be happy to share the results of that later this year. So next slide, please, and I'll wrap up. Again, summarizing the data points that I shared with you, again, the region lost more than 300,000 jobs in an extremely short period of time. We fared better than many of our metropolitan areas, and we've regained 180,000 of those jobs. But there are still, as you saw in that employment by sector chart, there are still many sectors of our economy, many workers in specific sectors who continue to be impacted, particularly in the hospitality industry. Our unemployment rate tripled, it's recovered, and we believe that we are on a steady track there, but we're still, as a region, about 2 points above where we had been prior to the pandemic. That third bullet, again, we are going to continue to monitor commercial real estate markets, both from the office leasing and retail leases as well. And then the planning directors, as I mentioned, will focus on how to address all of these different sectors going forward. And then next slide, please. Lastly, for this, the arc of this conversation, these presentations, as I said, this is an interdisciplinary, multi-departmental perspective. We have done presentations to the TPB last month, to planning directors who will likely be doing them to Region Forward next month. But again, there are opportunities to have COG staff come to this body at some point, as Mr. Shrikant suggested, to talk about any one of those particular domains, any one of those particular topic areas. And that is my last slide, Mr. Chairman. I'd be very happy to entertain any questions.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Desjardins, for your insights and the work that you are doing to coordinate all of the necessary stakeholders in the economic recovery of our region. I know we, as local government officials, have been acutely in the weeds with the acute effects of the pandemic, dealing with the effects on our budgets that we're trying to adopt amid a pandemic, and the very real human services needs that have manifest over the course of the last year. But this presentation, sobering reminder that as we deal with these acute effects, that there's going to be a long tail of the pandemic that's going to affect our office market, our housing market, all of the ways in which we regulate and tax consumption. So the tail could well exist long into the future. So we appreciate this very helpful and well done presentation. Questions from colleagues for Mr. Desjardins? And right now I cannot see you with boxes, so you'll have to speak up or, okay, now I can see you all. Well, Paul, Mayor Stewart looks like she has a question. All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul, for this excellent presentation. I know on your last slide, it said dig deeper into the data. And one of the things I wanted to know is particularly on unemployment data, is it possible to break that down more by race? We know that COVID-19 has had a greater impact on Black and Brown communities across the country and in our region. And we also know even before we got into the pandemic that unemployment rates and other things were not equal. And so I think it's important as we look at some of these numbers, it's good to see that we are gaining back some of these jobs, but we need to keep that in context of who's been hardest hit and who needs the most help in our communities.
It's a very good question. I apologize. I think I accidentally just muted myself. The short answer, Mayor Stewart, is not at this current time. We would, at some point in the future, be able to do a deeper dive by race and ethnicity on unemployment rates. There's kind of a trade-off between geography and the level of detail that is reported. I will say at the geographic level, it's very easy to track for individual jurisdictions, all the way down to jurisdictions like Tacoma Park, Laurel, and so forth. What are the current unemployment rates? But the more detailed data is something that would actually come farther in the future.
Thank you. I see Mr. Snyder's hand raised.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for this presentation. So what I'm particularly interested in is how we take this data and apply it to policies going forward and lessons learned. On the good side, there's more teleworking. Air quality has probably improved dramatically. How do we maintain those positive aspects at the same time address the negatives? Issues with obviously metro ridership and metro funding. What also does this say about the region's response to incidents like the pandemic? How can we coordinate better, possibly, although I thought the coordination was pretty good, particularly in the early days, but how can we coordinate better? And how can we be more nuanced and focused in our response? Recognizing that there are certain sectors that are going to be hit in any future pandemics as they were this time. So what are sort of the policy ramifications about this? What are the lessons learned, and how can we as a region preserve what little good has come out of this, but at the same time more effectively prevent and respond to the negatives, which are very clear and often are tragic from a human standpoint? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder.
Mr. Snyder, I have a brief response. I defer to my boss, Chuck, but I do think some of this exploration of what we're doing is trying to wrap our heads around, are these aberrations in some of these trends? Are they short term? And I think if we could roll this up into a conversation much later this year, I think it could inform all of our different policy committees. As I said, we'll be discussing this at Region Forward. I would suspect the human service challenges will be bringing it to the Human Services Committee. But I do think there's definitely the opportunity. I don't have the answer, but I do think there's a good body of knowledge that we could be bringing together to at least help foster a more focused policy discussion.
Thank you. Mr. Bean, would you like to add anything at this time? I know this is, sort of ever present in your thoughts.
Yeah, I think each of these disciplines is complex, but marrying across those disciplines is our opportunity. So the telework question, how much telework will have a residual effect in 22, 23? How fast can we get back on transit? Transit is safe, and definitely not just rail. We're also talking buses. So we've seen in the pandemic that buses have brought our frontline workers at a higher rate. What impact will e-commerce make? Will retail be different? And so the combination of telework and e-commerce, what patterns will that have on housing patterns? So preserving our big bet on transit-oriented development, transit-oriented communities, we got to take cognizance of changes on office space and lots of discussion about conversion of office space. So that's probably the biggest, in my mind, opportunity in the next year or two to rethink the conversion of office space when we take all these factors together.
Thank you, Mr. Bean. Any other questions or comments?
Mr. Chair.
Senator Barker.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman Dorsey. In Virginia, we've clearly had a dichotomy in terms of the economic effects. We have substantial number, particularly large companies in Virginia, have done extraordinarily well during this past year. Our corporate income tax revenues are up. Our personal income tax revenues are up, and we're actually running about 10%, a little over 10% ahead of where we were last year with general fund revenues. At the same time, what we've had is tremendous job loss, significant job losses, at least anyway, that have largely focused on people who are at the lower, below the median in terms of their income levels, which put them at made them much more vulnerable than if it had been more of the upper income people who had been affected. Certainly saw that in the slide on the the hospitality industry and those types of things there. Part of what I think our challenges are going to be, at least in Virginia, and I presume probably to a large extent in DC and Maryland as well, is how can we help those who lost jobs and the businesses that they used to be employed in, many of which have actually closed over the last year, while at the same time making sure that we continue to move our economies forward at an aggregate level.
Thank you very much for that update in the Commonwealth. Any comments from anyone? All right, for the last comment of our meeting, I'll recognize Supervisor Lusk.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the presentation very much, and I'll make this point really quickly. The office vacancy certainly is one that I'm going to watch very carefully, and I think the point on teleworking, I agree to the point earlier that there are some positives that come out of that, but clearly, if we start to see corporate users downsizing their footprint, that's going to affect the overall valuations of those properties, and that's going to affect the ability of local government to tax those commercial opportunities as well. So I think we've got to be very clear about what's going to be our response. Going back to the point that Chuck was making with regard to adaptive reusing, maybe thinking about some different ways to program that office space. So that's going to be important. And then the last thing I'll say is on the future of retail. I'll be really interested in seeing if we have any thoughts around that. And this is kind of dovetail back to Chuck's point as well, is I think on last mile, there's a lot of things that are going to be options for the future. And then how do we prepare and leverage our communities to take advantage of them? So just looking at what might be some of those new opportunities through some research and development that you guys have. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Lusk. And last opportunity for anyone to have their piece on this item. Seeing no interest, we do not have any other business on the agenda for today. So I would like to thank everyone for joining us for this, what I think was a very helpful and robust discussion on three very important issues for our community. Yes. And we so much appreciate your participation and look forward to having you all join again when we convene on April 14th, 2021. Is there a motion for us to adjourn?
Move adjournment. This is Derek Davis.
Thank you very much. The motion has been made. It has been seconded, and I see no opposition. So enjoy the weather and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.